God more than anything else. But you have this kind of scrambling for attention or scrambling for praise is part of the way in which people are playing with it. But she had asked if I could set up a visit for her to visit with Jeffrey Dahmer because she had converted Jeffrey Dahmer. So I asked about that, and the chaplain turned to Jeff and said, "Is she on your visitors list?" And this is the first time I've heard about this. And Jeff says, "No." And I found out prisoners have a visitors list where they have to write down the people they want to come visit them. And if you're on the list, you can come visit them. And if you're not on the list, I don't care how much you want to visit them, you're not going to go visit them, you know. And so, no, she's not on the visitors list. You want to put her on your visitors list? No, he didn't want to put her on his visitors list, which is a little bit surprising to me because I thought she was the one that Jeff was most connected with. I didn't know that he was actually connected to Curtis and others as well. She was just one character in a whole line of characters as far as Jeff was concerned. So the chaplain said to me, "Well, is she a church officiant?" Well, I'm hard-pressed to bend that one. She sends out Bible correspondence courses, something we call World Bible School. But I've been hard-pressed to say she's a church officiant, so I don't think I can call her that. Well, there's no way she can come and see you. And then the chaplain explained to me, "Look, I don't care how religious you are. You don't just walk in and say, 'I want to visit with Jeffrey Dahmer,' and you get a visit. You know, you've got to." And he explained to me that the prisoner's got to make a request, and then you respond to the request of the prisoner, and that's pretty much how the whole thing goes. You don't initiate it; the prisoner initiates it. And I've generally followed that procedure myself, although others have kind of challenged whether that's the way to do it or not. But generally, if someone wants me to visit a prisoner, I will usually write to the prisoner and say, "If you want me to come see you, you send me a letter and says, 'Please come see me.' And I can take this letter to the chaplain and say that this prisoner wants me to come see him." And I've done that, and I've never had any trouble seeing a prisoner, any prisoner I want to see, as long as I've got the letter from the prisoner indicating. But I've had some people say, "Would you go look at my brother, go look at my cousin, go look up this, that, the other. He really needs someone to see him." And I invariably will write to them and say, "You know, your brother, cousin, sister, uncle, whatever, you know, wants me to come see you. Do you want me to come see you?" Because a lot of times I've learned as a minister that a lot of times you have a family member that cares more about the person than the person themselves cares about it. And in the prison setting, you know, if the prisoner doesn't want you to come, there's no way you're going to get there. And so that's usually, sometimes they'll say, "Yes, come, quick." And others will say, others are just going to respond back at all, you know. So that's kind of how I've handled it. And I've kind of followed that rule of thumb in the prison ministry that's developed. And there is a prison ministry that has developed. But at that time, Jeffrey Dahmer was the culmination of all the prison ministry I've had. I didn't know any more. I was learning as I went. I was kind of making up as I went. And so from that point on, we started having regular visits with Jeff. I envisioned spending some time with the Gospel of John. I really liked the Jesus in John. And I wanted to introduce Jeff to Jesus. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted Jeff to kind of have a deeper understanding of what Jesus was all about. I wanted him to have a sense of grace, to understand what grace is all about. I wanted him to understand that he could become a Christian, he could grow as a Christian. And so I came with that in mind, but when I first got there, Jeff had other questions that he was really concerned about. And the first question was a big surprise to me. Someone had said to me before my first visit to Jeff, "What's he going to do about the Lord's Supper?" To which I said, "I don't know if he even knows about the Lord's Supper. That probably won't even come up." Well, the very first question Jeff asked me was, "What am I going to do about the Lord's Supper?" "What do you mean?" He says, "Well, they have a chapel here every Sunday, but they only serve the Lord's Supper on an average once a month. So they don't have it available all the time." He says, "I have a supply of crackers in my room, which I could use for communion bread, and I have a mixture of grape drink, which if I mix with water, could become grape juice. Would that be okay?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I think that'd be fine. I think God understands." "Well, I'm asking because," he says, and this gets to do with some of the bad material received, "I've received material that has told me that unless the juice is freshly squeezed, it's invalid. Frozen juice, you know, canned juice, it's got to be freshly squeezed, and I just can't get freshly squeezed juice here." I says, "Look, we serve a God who understands the situation you're in. You sometimes forget that our God understands where you are and what you're dealing with here. Is God able to understand what you can and can't do? Yes, God can understand that. I think God's going to understand that you're doing the best you can with what you've got. And my understanding is that God's going to have no problem with you eating your crackers and drinking your juice in your cell by yourself on a Sunday morning and observing the communion table. And so that's pretty much what he did. And he was kind of satisfied with that. But he'd be really troubled by what other people said and by what other people wrote. And that was really surprising to me where he got that, because that was one of the dumbest things I ever heard in my life. Was it's got to be this and nothing else. And yet it's believable because I've heard a lot of dumb things over the years as well too. So some people put a lot of stuff into it. And then they want to know about instrumental music. What I'm going to do about instrumental music, because in the Church of Christ we don't sing with a musical instrument. In fact, much of my life growing up, that was a major doctrinal issue. And I had worked through that issue myself a few years prior to that, where I didn't think, first of all, it was a biblical issue. It's an issue we sometimes try to make a biblical issue, but when you actually ask what the Scriptures actually say on the subject, you discover the Scriptures are not talking about that subject. And the passages we apply to that are not talking about that at all. They're talking about something entirely different. So I told him the point that I believed is that you need to take every advantage God has given you to live a Christian life. That means you need to be surrounded by as many people who claim the name of Christ as you possibly can, whether you agree with them or not. If they want to play a piano, if they want to sing with something else, let them do that. You're there to praise God, and just don't worry about the other stuff that's going on. But my father doesn't believe that. Well, I don't care what your father believed. And I had to spend some time. What about Ephesians 5:19? He argued about Ephesians 5:19. So he'd been into this debate thing. So we spent some time with Ephesians 5. And so I took him there and I said, well, look at Ephesians 5. Give me the sense of the context there. Well, he didn't know from context. I mean, one of the funniest movies that my family enjoys is called, I can't remember what it's called. It's something about the gods. But it's about it's in Africa where you've got this.
Gods Must Be Crazy.
The Gods Must Be Crazy, yeah.
One of my favorite movies.
Yeah, it's a tremendous little movie because you've got this Aboriginal fella who's suddenly thrown out of his culture and so forth, and the narrator is trying to explain what he's talking about, and of course you have this one scene where he jumps into a Jeep, and the guy says, "Why didn't you use the door?" And the guy's answer, he doesn't know from doors, and it's kind of, to me, answers an awful lot of questions about an awful lot of things. Sometimes I don't know from doors either, so I just kind of jump in and have no idea what I'm talking about and so forth. But we jump into these sort of things and kind of get where we're at and so forth. Not trying to remember where I got off to before I started that line of thought, because I've strayed a little bit. But getting back to my point. Instrumental music, that's what it was, yeah. So I asked him, Jeffrey doesn't know from context, So let's look at the context. And so you spend time going into Ephesians chapter 5, and you discover that there's three kinds, and the old King James, I used, because I first went, the old King James used the word walk. Walk in love, and walk in light, and walk in wisdom. And here in the new NIV that I was using, it says live, is what I'm talking about. But you talk about three different processes as you go through here. And when you walk in love, that means you're going to live a life of love. And when you walk in the light, then you're going to live according to the light. When you come to the wisdom, which is where the passage about the singing is all about, you're showing wisdom here. And so I'm asking the question to him, just exactly where does singing in the church start here? It's not in the context. He's not talking about the church. He's talking about the way you live your life. And so this context of singing is not talking about what you do in church. It's talking about what you do in your life. And so I was making the point that my understanding of the Scriptures is Paul's not giving us direction on how we should sing in a church. He's talking about how we live our lives. And your life should be so full of the Spirit that the songs of your faith emanate from you on a daily basis. When you're sweeping the floor, when you're driving down the road, when you're, taking a walk, when you're doing whatever it is you do, you're singing the songs of your faith because your faith is so cherished by you that this is a reflection of what's going on. Well, he never thought of that before. He never seen that. And so he began to realize that, well, I guess the musical instrument thing isn't such a big issue. So he began then deciding to go to chapel on a regular basis. In June, I was at camp, doing a camp session, so I missed 2 weeks with him. And while I was gone, he was attacked by a Cuban. He was sitting in chapel, and the chapel had ended, and a Cuban had come up to him with a razor blade attached to a toothbrush by a piece of tape, Scotch tape. And he come up and grabbed Jeff around the head and took the tape and was going to cut his throat. And in the process of doing that, the whole tape thing disintegrated, and all he ended up doing was just scratching Jeff across the neck. And there was a little bit of wrestling going on. Jeff got his glasses knocked off and so forth, and the guards wanted the guy, and they put both of them into the segregation because of the prison theology, thinking if you're in trouble or if you're anywhere near trouble, you've got to be at fault. Of course, Jeff was at fault for sitting there and for being famous, is what it came down to. But at any rate, the next time I come to visit him, he was showing me the imprint on the cuffs that they, where they had squished his hands and so forth. But he was let out just before I got there, and so he was talking to me about how this person had tried to kill him. I get calls then from brethren across the nation in the prison ministry who are saying to me, "Why is Jeffrey Dahmer in chapel? Didn't you teach him that he can't go to chapel? Didn't you teach him that because of the musical instruments there, he's not allowed to worship with those other people?" And I said, no, I taught Jeff that he needs to be around as many Christians as he possibly can to absorb as much Christian faith as he possibly can in whatever context he's in. That's what I believe. That's what I taught. And that's how I apply my understanding of grace to the situation. See, part of it comes down to my understanding of God's ability to understand where we are. And sometimes, like seeds, we're planted in good soil, and sometimes, like seed, we're planted in bad soil. Does God understand the soil you're planted in? Does he understand the kind of choices available to you or that are not available to you in the context of your life that you're living in? I think God does. A couple of years ago, there was a young man that was killed in a terrible auto accident. He had been to a bar. He was too drunk to drive home. He got a ride from someone else to drive him home because he was too drunk to drive home. Very noble of him. Except the person he got a ride with was more drunk than he was. Drove into a tree and it killed him. I'm called because his mother has a Church of Christ heritage. Like Jeff, she quit going when she was a small child. But the only faith she ever knew was the Church of Christ. So when it comes time to, I need a funeral guy, I'm going to revert back to history. And so I am called upon to do the funeral. And it's a very sad, sad story, and I won't go into all of that. But after the funeral's over, the woman that comes up to me has a special meeting with me, and she says to me, "Where is my son now?" Specifically, is my son in hell? Is my son in heaven? You tell me, preacher. And I had to say to her, I know you love your son, but once he's dead, your son is no longer your business. It's God's business now. And God is a fair judge. God's a more fair judge than I am. I'm an unjust judge. I cannot tell you because I don't know. But I do know this about God. God is merciful, God is kind, God's compassionate. And God understands the opportunities that your son had and rejected, and the opportunities your son didn't have to come to faith. And God will take all that into consideration, and God will make a fair judgment. Now, I believe the same thing is true about Jeffrey Dahmer. I think the same thing is true about so many things that come down the pike. A lot of times we get in trouble because we're judging from a false standard. We're judging in the wrong sort of thing. Can God understand, Jeff, that you're in prison? Can he understand that your opportunities are limited because you're in prison? I think he can. Can he understand that the only contact you have with people who claim to be Christians are what's going on in chapel? I think he can. Your duty is to absorb as much Christianity as you possibly can because you're starting behind everyone else. And you've got to build faith. And I'll keep meeting with you, and if you have any questions along the line, we will discuss this as we go. So that was the first meeting. We spent time talking about that. The next meeting we came together, he wanted to talk about the version of the Bible. The only version of the Bible you're allowed to use is the King James Version. That was a position he held. And he had studies he brought with him about proving that the King James Greek text was superior to all other Greek texts. Well, fortunately, I had already studied that. And I had explained to him as gently as I could, no, that's a bunch of baloney. That just simply isn't true. The modern translations are just as valid, if not even more so, than the King James. And there's reasons, there's problems with that, and that's a whole other study which I won't go into in great detail. But I wasn't able to convince him. But I was able to reach a compromise with him. I said, look, you study from your King James Bible, and that's okay. And I'll study from the NIV. I won't judge you, and you won't judge me. And that was okay. We worked out that solution. And then, of course, he came back with the baptismal formula. Was my baptism in error because it wasn't in the name of Jesus? So I spent some time talking with him, explaining how in the name of an expression that means by the authority of. He said, you were baptized by the authority of Jesus. That's what occurred. And so it doesn't really matter whether we use this language or that language. God isn't so much interested in the language. It's not like, there's a magical formula here. God's interested in the heart. And was your heart turning to God? Yes, it was. Were you trying to serve God? Yes, you were. And I tell all these little stories to emphasize one thing about Jeffrey Dahmer, and some of you can really identify with this if you've been in the Church of Christ a long time. And that is, we have a heritage that's very rich and very deep, but we also have a heritage that's been corrupted by a legalistic approach to the Scriptures. He had a very legalistic approach to the Scriptures. He was worried about getting all the ducks in order. I want everything to be right. Why? Because I've been wrong so much. I can't stand for anything to be not right. And that was his biggest concern. And so I was trying to explain to him that there's a certain area we call grace, which allows you to have differences here. And it doesn't really matter whether you're right or wrong, because you can't sometimes know what's right or what's wrong. But God's able to understand you. God's able to understand where you're coming from. And so that kind of settled down for him a little bit, and that was a little bit easier. And so we discussed occasionally other questions that arise from here and there, and I don't recall, though I've discussed with you some of the big questions that really bothered him at first. Later on then, he made some remark about his concern that there was something going on in Europe. Oh, I know what it was. They were coming up with this, I think it was either the currency or they were working on this currency in Europe and so forth. And he was so afraid that this is a fulfillment of the prophecy of Daniel chapter 2, the 10 toes, And I said, well, I don't understand Daniel's referring to that at all. And he was talking about what we would call premillennial doctrine, And I said, I don't understand the book of Revelation to be talking about that at all. He was really shocked at that. How can you be a Christian and not think that? Well, I've studied the Bible. That's why I think that. Well, let's study the book of Revelation together. So I'll be glad to study the book of Revelation with you, but first, I insist that we study the book of Hebrews first. Because the book of Hebrews, I have found, gives you keys that opens doors to the book of Revelation. It's amazing how many hints and clues you get out of the book of Hebrews that helps you understand what the book of Revelation is all about. Okay, well that made sense. So we started studying our way through the book of Hebrews, and we studied all the way through the book of Hebrews. And along the way, then little bits and pieces here and there would come up. For instance, when we came to the part about how sin is deceptive, he would reveal that as long as he could hide the bodies, as long as he could hide his crimes from himself, he didn't have to think about them. He could live his life in a normal way and wouldn't have to worry about that. And I remember thinking when I heard that, that sounds very normal, Jeff. I don't know how many times I've known people in the church who had problems. But as long as they could wear long sleeves and hide the bruises or hide the drug, holes, as long as they could pretend like everything's all right, put on a smiling face, everything's fine, and no one knows the difference. I've heard people talk about how coming to church in the car, it's a mad fight with one another. They're turning each other down. But they get to church, suddenly the smiles come on, and it's quiet and serene, and they sit in church and everything is wonderful because we were the ideal family. And they get back in the car and they're fighting again, And I've had kids say to me, the parents you see here